Hello and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from today. I am Sharita McGee. I am a realtor with eXp here in Houston, Texas, and just coming to you hoping that I can share a bit of knowledge with you to make your day and your upcoming real estate transactions go a little bit more smoothly. So, what I really wanted to talk about today is something that I am starting to encounter with a lot of my buyers a little more frequently, and that is FIRPTA. So you may or may not be aware of that acronym and what it means, but that is the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. And the real purpose of FIRPTA is to ensure that non-residents or foreign persons who own property in the United States file all the necessary tax documents and adhere to what their tax responsibility is regarding the sale or transfer of their properties here in the US. And so, one thing that I really want to point out at the top of the conversation is that when we talk about FIRPTA, the tax responsibility, the actual documentation of the sale, all of those things, although it is the seller who is the non resident, ensuring that the right documents and the proper check amount get to the IRS is on the onus for that is on the buyer, according to the way that that act is written. Of course, if you are working with an excellent title company, they will hold your hand all the way through that process, and they will even assist you with making sure that the check gets sent off to the IRS and all the proper documents get sent off to the IRS. So really important to ensure that you've got a great title company, like right there next to you, a phone call away that you can reach out to at any time. I've got mine. If you ever need a referral, feel free to reach out to me, especially if you're in the greater Houston area. The title companies that I prefer to work with have multiple locations, and so they can get to you and assist you with closings from Cypress to Sugarland, Rocheron, Pearland, Katy, Fulshire, and so on. So just let me know if you ever need a referral for a great title company. I'd be happy to help. But I want to jump back into FIRPTA really quickly and just point out a couple of things that are kind of important details that we should talk about when we're discussing FIRPTA. How to identify whether or not FIRPTA applies to the transaction that you're working on. What are some of the exceptions to FIRPTA? What might those tax liabilities look like? So let's jump into that. All right, so we really want to be able to define whether or not a person is considered a foreign person or if they're considered a resident for the purpose of FIRPTA. We never want to make any assumptions, and we definitely don't want to offend anyone by asking the questions in the wrong way. So let's define what's considered a non-resident or foreign person. If a person has been issued a green card, then they are automatically considered a U.S. resident if that green card was issued anytime during the prior calendar year. Or you can always use the IRS's substantial presence test, which means that if that person for the calendar year has been in the US for more than 182.5 days, then FIRPTA may not apply to them. They may get an exemption even if they don't have a green card and or if they're not a US resident. So that's a really broad definition when we talk about resident versus non-resident, right? You or your agent can reach out to the title company very early and have them issue a certificate of non-foreign status. That is a document that the seller would sign acknowledging or disclosing their status in terms of whether or not they're a resident or a non-resident of the US. That can be very helpful with getting some of the FIRPTA conversations out of the way early. On the buyer side of a deal dealing with FIRPTA, you have a lot of responsibility. You're responsible for submitting documentation to the IRS. You're responsible for ensuring that the tax responsibility of the seller is collected at closing and sent off to the IRS as well. So, what does that look like for you as the buyer? Well, it could be anywhere from 0% of the sales price to 15% of the sales price, just depending on one, whether or not you as the buyer are going to keep that home or live in that home as your primary residence, and the sale price of the home. So, if your sale price is under $300,000 and you're going to live in it as your primary residence, there may be no tax responsibility for the seller, so nothing to collect at closing from that regard. If the sale price is over $300,000 or you're not going to use it as your primary residence once the deal is done, then there's a different situation to discuss. In other instances, if you are or are not going to use the home as your primary residence is a huge factor in how much the seller may owe to the IRS for their tax. If the home is over $300,000 and you, as the buyer, are going to live in the home as your primary residence, then the seller may only be held liable for about 10% of the sale price. If you are not going to use the home as your primary residence, or you'd prefer to cover all bases by allowing the maximum withholding from the seller, that would be 15% of the sales price. Again, that is the sales price of the house and not the seller's profit. This is not a capital gains tax, so this is not based on how much profit is left after all liens are paid. This is off of the sales price as documented in the contract. In any event, whether you end up withholding 10% or 15% of the sales price to cover the seller's tax responsibility, it is critically important that within 20 days of your closing, all documents and the check for the seller's tax responsibility are submitted to the IRS. You don't want to let that get to day 21. Get it submitted to the IRS as soon as possible, and then once you have confirmation of receipt, you want to save all of that in case there's any questions in the future. Then you'll always be able to fall back on your documentation that one, all paperwork was submitted, and two, the check was cashed by the IRS. So this was just a quick crash course in FERPTA. There's so many nuances and so many other details that we could discuss, but I won't take up too much more of your time with that information. If you have any questions or you, again, need a referral to a great title company, I'd be happy to help you with that. If you are a seller and maybe you have some questions about what your tax liability might be under FERPTA, feel free to give me a call. My number, my email address, everything is always in the details. You can find that below. I'm available and willing to help whenever you're ready.